Widowed rancher found a Apache widow living in a barn. Next morning, he moved her into his home. Snow had a way of swallowing sound in the high country, turning the world into a white hush that felt like the inside of a held breath. Elias Beaumont rode through it with his collar turned up and his grief turned inward, the rein stiff with frost beneath his gloves. He had gone out searching for a stray calf before the storm worsened, but halfway across the north pasture he saw something unexpected. A thin braid of smoke rising from the old collapsed barn, the one nobody had used since his wife died. It curled upward as if calling him closer, stirring a curiosity he hadn't felt in months. His horse slowed, hooves sinking deep. Elias stared at the smoke, wondering who else would be out here on a night like this. A storm could kill a grown man, and yet someone had kindled a fire inside his broken barn. The wind pressed against the barn's weakened boards, making them groan like tired bones. As he stepped off the saddle, a strange feeling tugged at him, the kind that whispered something in his life was about to change. He didn't yet know whether that thought scared him or steadied him, and that uncertainty pushed him forward with cautious resolve. He pulled open the barn door, and his lantern's glow revealed a figure curled near a small fire built from broken timber. A woman sat there, knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold. Her face was half hidden in her long dark hair, but her posture spoke of exhaustion deeper than weather. When she lifted her chin, her eyes reflected the lantern light with a quiet defiance, like an ember refusing to die. Elias felt himself pause, breath caught with surprise at seeing an Apache woman sheltered in his barn. Curiosity rose in him as quickly as the cold. The woman didn't move. She watched him as though deciding whether he meant danger or mercy. Elias saw how raw the winter had been to her. Snow clung to her braids. Her skin was windburned, and her hands trembled slightly in the firelight. She looked like someone who had fought her way through every mile of the storm and still expected the world to take the little warmth she'd found. He knew that feeling better than he wished. He kept his voice steady, gentle, the way he used to speak to skittish horses. "You're freezing," he murmured. "This barn won't keep the storm off much longer." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a wary instinct shaped by survival. She said nothing. Elias took one step inside, careful not to block the doorway, letting her see that she still had a way out. He knew too well the look of someone who had been given reasons not to trust. The woman lifted her chin, breath fogging in the cold air, and after a long moment spoke in a voice soft but edged with warning. "I won't take your things." The words hit Elias harder than he expected. He realized she had assumed the worst simply because that was all she'd been taught to expect from others. He shook his head, the gesture small, offering no threat, only acknowledgement. "I'm not worried about that," he said. "I'm worried you'll freeze." Her gaze flickered, uncertainty rippling through her guarded calm. He set the lantern on a beam and crouched near the fire, far enough not to intrude yet close enough to show he wasn't afraid. The warmth stung his chilled fingers. For a moment neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It brimmed with questions neither knew how to voice. "My name's Elias," he finally said. "This ranch, it's mine." The woman considered him with a stillness more expressive than any movement. She seemed to take stock of the shape of his shoulders, the roughness of his gloves, the weariness in his eyes that mirrored her own. Then she spoke with hesitant calm. "Tayan," she said, "I only needed shelter from the snow. I'll leave by morning." Her name lingered in the cold air, soft and steady like a stone resting against the earth. Elias felt something shift inside him, a recognition, perhaps, of someone else living under the same weight he carried. He didn't want her to leave the barn to face the storm again, but he knew pushing her too soon would make her run. Curiosity tugged at him, urging him to ask how long she'd been traveling, what had driven her into such desolation, but he held the questions back. Instead, he offered the only thing he could. "I've got warm stew in the house." Tayan's shoulders tightened, and a shadow crossed her expression. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the cost that kindness usually demanded. Elias felt shame burn through him, not for himself, but for whatever men she had met before him. He kept his voice steady. "It's just food," he said quietly. "Nothing more." The wind howled across the pasture, rattling the barn door. Tan looked toward the sound, then toward the thin blanket around her shoulders. Her hesitation carried a lifetime of warnings. Finally she nodded, but only once, as if agreeing to a fragile truce. Elias stood and offered no hand, only space for her to walk if she chose. She followed slowly, her steps careful, as though expecting the snow to swallow her whole if she moved too quickly. Something about her steadiness drew him in, making him want to understand the depth that lived in her silence. Inside the house, warm air greeted them like a forgotten memory. Tan stood just past the threshold, not stepping further, as if fearful of leaving tracks on a life she didn't belong to. Elias ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table, then stepped back, waiting. She approached in small, guarded strides. When she lifted the spoon, her hand trembled, not from the cold, but from the discomfort of being given something without demand. Elias felt the weight of her pride, her fear, her solitude. He wondered who had taught her to expect punishment for hunger. She ate slowly, eyes lowered, as though absorbing every detail of the warmth around her. Elias leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise from her bowl and giving her quiet, respectful distance. For the first time in months, he realized the house didn't feel empty. The thought unsettled and steadied him all at once, creating a tender confusion he hadn't anticipated. He wondered if she felt it too. When she finished, Tan placed the bowl down carefully, as though returning something sacred. She looked at him directly now, her dark eyes strong enough to meet his, yet soft enough to reveal the exhaustion etched beneath. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said. "Thank you for feeding me." Elias shook his head before she even finished. "You won't make it till morning. The storm's getting worse." Her lips pressed together, a flicker of conflict crossing her features. He could see her fighting the instinct to refuse help, the instinct to protect herself at all costs. Elias stepped aside, allowing her to see the small guest room down the hall, door open, blankets freshened earlier out of habit. He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, just held the space open like a gentle invitation. "You can take that room," he said softly. "Lock the door if it makes you easier. No one will bother you." Tan stayed still for several long seconds. Outside, snow slammed against the house with a force that shook the shutters. She flinched slightly, and Elias saw how deeply the cold had carved fear into her bones. Finally, she stepped toward the hallway, pausing at the entrance to the room. She looked back once, studying him as though seeing something she'd never expected to find in a stranger, a man with no demands in his eyes. "Only for the night," she said, voice quiet but sure. Elias nodded. "Only for the night." She slipped inside and closed the door, not completely, but just enough to feel safe. Elias remained in the lamplit kitchen for a long while, listening to the muffled storm outside and the faint presence of another soul breathing under his roof. Something about it filled the house with a fragile warmth he hadn't felt since before the world broke around him. Yet that warmth carried a weight he didn't yet understand. When he finally walked to his own room, fatigue settling into his shoulders, he felt a strange pull in his chest, a sense that the storm had brought more than snow, more than trouble, more than a wandering soul seeking shelter. The feeling lingered, subtle but insistent, as he lay awake long after the lamp went dark. And as the wind pushed against the walls through the night, Elias realized he wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. He was waiting for morning, and the woman who now slept down the hall, wrapped in a fear and hope he suddenly wished to unravel. The storm eased by dawn, leaving a quiet so pure it felt as though the world had been washed clean. Elias woke before the light touched the snow, a habit carved from years of ranching, yet this morning felt different, charged, expectant, as if someone had knocked on the inside of his ribs. He stepped into the hallway, boots soft on the wooden floor, and paused outside the guest room door. It was still slightly ajar, just as she'd left it. That small gap tugged at him with a gentleness he didn't understand, stirring a curiosity that warmed the cold inside his chest. He didn't nudge the door open. He didn't dare. Instead, he brewed coffee, letting the rich smell fill the kitchen. The sun crept slowly over the ridgeline, casting gold across the snow. When he finally heard soft footsteps behind him, he didn't turn immediately, afraid the moment might shatter if he moved too quickly. Taein stood beside the doorway, wrapped in the blanket he'd left folded at the foot of the bed. Her hair was loose now, falling over her shoulders in waves that caught the morning light. Yet her eyes still held caution, like someone who expected warmth to vanish the moment she reached for it. "You slept?" Elias asked quietly. She gave a small nod. "The walls kept the wind out." A simple answer, yet loaded with something deeper. Relief, perhaps, or disbelief. Elias poured a cup and slid it across the table. Taein watched it as though she had been taught to question every gift. But she approached slowly, her fingers curling around the warm mug with a tenderness that told him warmth was not something she often allowed herself. Elias sat across from her, leaning back, giving her the same unspoken distance he'd given the night before. Outside, the world glowed. Inside, tension lived between them like a fragile thread, pulling them closer even as they both feared the weight of it. Taein took a sip, and her lashes trembled. Elias wondered what her life had been before this barn, before this storm, before his quiet kitchen. He wondered how many times she had been turned away. She set the mug down. "I should go." The words fell like cold water, though her tone was steady, resolved. Elias studied her face, the way her jaw tightened, as if preparing to protect herself. He didn't reach out. He didn't argue. But something in him refused the idea of her stepping back into the wasteland of cold and memory. "You can leave," he said softly, "if that's what you want." But the storm buried half the trail, and the river ice broke last night. Travel alone would be dangerous. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the snow still stood in drifts taller than a horse's chest. She didn't deny the truth of his words, but her shoulders tensed as if fighting the instinct to run. Elias continued gently, choosing words that carried no demands. "You don't have to stay forever. Just stay until the path clears." Taein looked down at her hands. They were calloused, scraped, marked by survival. She swallowed hard. People don't want an Apache woman under their roof. Elias felt shame strike him again, sharper this time. Not for anything he'd done, but for the world that had taught her a roof meant judgment, not shelter. He kept his tone even, though his chest tightened. "This house isn't people. It's just me." Taein lifted her gaze to him, and in that fragile second he felt something shift, some boundary inside her cracking just enough for light to slip through. But before she could speak, a sound echoed through the snowy yard, the sharp thud of hooves against frozen ground. Elias stiffened. Taein's breath hitched. Curiosity flared, sharp, electric, as they exchanged a glance that carried a single question neither dared voice. Elias went to the window. 3 riders approached from the south ridge, their coats dark against the snow. Men from town. He recognized the lead rider, Silas Crowley, a man who saw kindness as weakness and difference as threat. Elias felt his jaw clench. Taein's spine straightened, her hand tightening on the blanket. He turned to her. "Stay in here, no matter what you hear." Taein opened her mouth to protest, but something in his voice, something steady, something earnest, held her still. She nodded once, though her breathing had gone tight with old fear. Elias stepped outside as the riders slowed. Snow crunched under their horses. Silas's smirk was already settled on his face, oily and sharp. "Heard you found yourself a trespasser last night," Silas drawled. "Word gets around quick." Elias didn't flinch. "You heard wrong." Silas leaned forward on his saddle. Old Cyrus from the trading post said an Apache woman was seen heading this way before the storm hit. Figured she'd be sniffing around for handouts. "That's enough," Elias said quietly. But Silas only laughed. "Come on now. If she's here, best turn her over before folks start thinking you're keeping trouble. You know how these winters go, people get nervous, suspicious." Behind the door, Taein heard every word. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing years of being hunted, mistrusted, erased. Shame surged in her throat, ugly and familiar. She pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, torn between running and staying. Outside, Elias stood firm. "You're not coming inside, and you're not taking anyone from here." Silas's smirk twisted. Didn't realize you had something worth guarding. The insult stung Elias sharper than the cold. He stepped closer to Silas's horse, eyes unwavering. Go home, Silas. The air crackled with a different kind of storm, quiet, tense, waiting to erupt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Silas clicked his tongue, pulling his horse back. Suit yourself. But if she's here, that's on you. Folks won't be kind. They turned away, hooves pounding across the snow, leaving a trail of suspicion in their wake. When Elias entered the house again, Tayan stood in the center of the kitchen, stiff as carved wood. Her eyes were dark with fear and something else he couldn't name. You should have let them take me, she whispered. Your life would be easier. Elias shut the door behind him, snow still clinging to his coat. My life hasn't been easy since long before last night. She looked at him, startled by the depth in his voice. He took a step closer, not enough to corner her, just enough for his sincerity to reach her. You deserve a place where people don't hunt you, he said. You deserve warmth, safety, choice. Tayan's throat tightened. Choice. It was a word she rarely tasted. She moved toward the window, watching the riders fade into the distant white. Her breath shook. If I stay, they will come back. They might, Elias answered honestly. But you won't be alone. The honesty startled her more than any promise would have. She turned toward him, her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulder. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, two wounded souls circling the edges of something unnamed. Then, softly, almost reluctantly, Tayan spoke. Why are you helping me? Elias hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't scare her away. Because someone should have helped you long before now. Her breath caught. A fragile silence settled between them, warm and shivering at once. Something in her expression softened, something that had been iron for years melting just a little. But before either could say more, a gust of wind slammed against the house, startling the shutters. Tayan flinched, instinctively stepping closer to him. It was not a deliberate choice, just a reflex, born of fear and trust warring in her chest. Elias didn't touch her. He simply stood steady beside her, anchoring her with his presence. In that small, trembling moment, their closeness felt like the spark at the heart of a long winter. Outside, the world was still dangerous. Inside, something fragile had begun to bloom. And though Tayan didn't say it, though Elias didn't push for it, something in her posture, her shoulders loosening, her breath easing, whispered the truth neither of them dared name yet. She was no longer planning to leave. Not today. Not while the snow still held her. Not while his quiet strength held her place in the world like a shelter she'd never known. And somewhere deep in the marrow of that morning, both their lives quietly shifted toward the same horizon, though neither yet understood how deeply the coming days would bind them, or how fierce the world would be when it learned she was no longer alone.